In today's video, I want to stick to one main tip, one recommendation that honestly, if I could go back in time to the beginning of my own journey with watercolor, if I could just advise myself anything, it would be this. And it would have made both my painting process go a lot more smoothly, have it be a lot more enjoyable. It would have also greatly improved or increased my chances of arriving at more successful paintings that I was actually happy with and that I didn't want to immediately throw away. I don't know about you guys, but when I was first getting started on my own painting journey, I was very excited, very eager to just get on with the painting. And almost always I ended up very underwhelmed with the results. And I honestly was just creating more frustration than I needed to. And I was just making my progress as an artist harder than it needed to be. This tip goes especially for you guys who are already past at least that beginner level when painting with watercolor, and you're already starting to explore creating your own original pieces from scratch. So what do I mean by this? I mean that you are taking your own art reference photos, or at least looking for your own photos online to work from, or you're arranging your own still life compositions to paint from direct observation, preparing your own models, whatever it is. But you're coming up with your own original artwork and not necessarily following a step-by-step tutorial. All right, so having said that, the one tip that I want to share with you today is to always go in with a strategy. And this may sound simple, but it's one thing to know it, and it's quite another to actually apply it. And when you apply it in a smart way, it makes all the difference in the world. So what do I mean with going in with a strategy? Let's talk about this first so that we're all on the same page. What I mean is asking yourself some questions, doing at least a little bit of planning before getting started with the painting process, so that you can at least have a basic strategy that you're going to be working through. This doesn't mean that you cannot slightly veer off this general path that you create for yourself. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to run into, little mistakes or accidents or things that you hadn't thought of that would pop up. It always happens. You always have to use your critical thinking to kind of see how you're going to fix that problem or incorporate it as part of the piece or whatever it is. But it just means that you have this general path that you're going to be following, because you've already kind of visualized your end product before going in. Preparing for a new piece also means at least spending a few minutes creating some quick thumbnail sketches, giving thought to your composition, making sure that you are arranging things within space and doing your cropping and framing just the way that you like it, to make sure that you're creating a visually pleasing, balanced looking composition that actually keeps the viewer's eyes moving through the piece and is interesting to look at. It also means that you've prepared the specific colors that you're going to be using so that you are able to create a composition that has harmony to it, and you don't end up creating muddy colors or undesired colors when you're mixing those colors together. All of these things you've given thought to, at least in a very basic way, before jumping in. And when it comes to working with watercolor specifically, a lot of you who have been working on this medium for any amount of time, you're probably already well aware of how difficult, how challenging, how tricky it is. We're not able to just go in and cover up our layer of paint with another layer of paint like we can do with acrylics or oils, because watercolor is transparent. There is no way to take back that paint after we have laid it down on paper, and it's going to be visible always, right? So because of all of these reasons and the inherent characteristics of watercolor, it's even more important to go in with some sort of strategy. And when it comes to using this medium, I feel it's so important, and it's made such a huge difference for me that when you are either producing your reference photos, developing your arrangement or whatever it is that you're having in front of you to paint from direct observation, when you have that reference, whatever it is that you're going to be using, stop and visualize what you want your final painting to look like. Because as artists, it's not just about copying what it is that's, appearing in your reference. It's about making choices. What is going to be your focal point? What is going to be kind of secondary, tertiary elements that are going to be supporting the focal point? How is it that you're going to be bringing yourself into the picture and making interesting use of color and different techniques? It's not just about taking what's in your reference and trying to create a carbon copy of it. It's about bringing yourself into your artwork and thinking about what it is that you want to say about that particular subject, as common and trivial as it may seem, and really giving thought to the specific techniques that are going to help you enhance your painting and make proper use of the painting medium on hand. What sections do you want blurred out or with beautiful organic gradients turning from one color into another color, that kind of effect? And what sections do you want sharp details in? Where are you going to be developing sharper details, more details, things like that? By asking yourself these questions, you can start understanding or taking notes, creating a strategy for yourself in terms of where you're going to be using wet on wet techniques, where you're going to be using wet on dry, where you're going to be using a combo of both, how many layers you're going to be needing, etc. I get a lot of questions via email, via my different social media platforms, and this is also something that many of my one-on-one students have asked me, and this is, how do you know where to start? And then how do you know how to flow through the painting process, right? And this is why. It's because I give thought to these things before. Not absolutely everything that you create has to have a plan and a strategy behind it. But I would say if you're going to be spending hours on one single piece, then at least take like 10 minutes of time prior to getting started to think about a strategy. And then you're always going to have smaller studies, smaller explorations that you don't need any planning or strategizing for. Those can be in your sketchbook or just smaller pieces that you're intending to spend less time on. So I want to provide 6 things to run through in your head at least, or even like do notes, create thumbnails, do swatches so that you can prepare your colors, whatever it is. 6 steps for you to go through before setting paintbrush on paper. And if you go through these steps, I assure you that it's a lot more likely that your painting process is going to go a lot more smoothly for you, and there's a greater chance of you arriving at something that you actually like. Step number 1 is going to be to visualize what you want your painting to look like. Okay, so remember, you're not copying your reference, whatever it is that you're using. You're using that as a jump off point, okay? So take your reference, it called your attention for a reason, or you arranged it that way for a reason, right? But then how are you going to be turning that into a painting? What's going to be your focal point? What's going to be the secondary and tertiary supportive elements? What do you want sharper and kind of more detailed? And what do you want blurred out? How are you going to be creating a background if it's going to have a background? All that kind of stuff. Visualize your colors. What color scheme are you going to be using in order to transmit the emotion or idea that you're wanting to transmit? Or how are you going to be making interesting use of color in your piece, or using color temperature, things like that? Visualize it, okay? Step number 2 is going to be to make sure that you've given thought to composition. So oftentimes, even when we produce a great art reference photo, or we found one, or even when we have something in front of us in real life that we're going to paint, it's important to give thought to the framing. What's inside? What's going to be left out? Are we going to be modifying that cropping in a photo editing software? You know, rarely is that photo going to be perfect the way that it is. I always open up my reference photos in Photoshop and modify that cropping at least a tiny bit. It's also important to give thought to, you know, the format that you're going to be painting in. If you're going to be painting on a rectangle and your photograph or image that you're seeing is a square or vice versa, that is not going to be very helpful. I always make sure that the image that I am seeing in my computer screen is in the same, proportions that I have in my actual substrate that I'm going to be painting on. It's also super important to give thought to the amount of negative space around the subject. Sometimes there is a ton in reference photos that we come across, and the subject looks like it's lost in that vast emptiness, and we need to crop it a bit. The arrangement of the different elements within space. Are you going to be taking something out from that landscape photo that you see that is not adding to the composition? Are you going to be bringing something in? Or do you need another reference photo of this animal to bring it into your piece? Whatever it is, what are you going to be doing in terms of composition design? Third thing that is going to make it a lot more likely that you're not going to run into undesired accidents throughout the process, and that you're going to arrive at more successful results when it comes to painting with watercolor, is giving thought to your colors, pre-selecting your colors before starting to paint. I've talked about the importance of this before, but always pre-select the colors that you're going to be using. Test out the color mixers that you're going to be using. This is super important because color is an element of art that is going to help us add harmony, create harmony in our artwork. And at the same time, if we don't give thought to color and we don't test color mixers out before going in, it's a lot more likely that we're going to end up creating colors that we didn't necessarily want. Step number 4 is, now that you visualize your final piece, what you want in terms of the effects for the different parts of your painting, what you want blurred out, what you want sharp, what you want more details in. Think of the specific watercolor techniques that are going to help you achieve said effects. So if you want blurred out edges and you want those colors to start merging into each other in a very organic way, then think of maybe pre-wetting your paper until you have a nice even sheen to start dropping your color into, or other types of wet on wet techniques. Whereas if you're looking for sharper edges and adding in very sharp detail, then you're gonna most likely want to go in wet on dry. And you're gonna have to make sure that that previous layer of paint has completely dried before going in and adding your details or darkening certain areas or whatever it may be. Throughout the watercolor painting process, it's so important to stay patient and to constantly be checking on the level of wetness of the different sections of your paper, and just asking yourself constantly if it's safe to continue placing color in there, or even right next to that area that you just painted in. Because if that area is super wet, you start painting in an area beside it, that color can start bleeding in, and that might not be something that you want. So it's just very important to constantly check on the level of wetness of your paper and ask yourself if it makes sense for you to go in, or if you need to allow that area to dry. Step number 5 is to ask yourself, how many layers are you thinking of developing? And yes, sometimes we end up creating even more layers or adding final little details more than we initially anticipated, but it's so helpful to go in with at least a vague idea of the number of layers that we're thinking of painting. Usually, when you're thinking of creating that looser, more expressive watercolor style, 1 or 2 layers is gonna be enough. But if you're thinking of creating higher levels of realism and more detail, most likely than not, you're gonna require 3 to 4 layers, maybe even more than that. And this has to do, once again, with what you initially visualized. What did you visualize in terms of your overall style and the level of detail? And the final step, step number 6, is going to be to make sure that you are preparing or selecting the specific paper and paintbrushes that are going to help you for the specific piece on hand. This is so important because the paper makes all the difference in the world. By this point, if you have been exploring different types of paper, different brands, you've already seen the huge difference that it makes both in the painting process as well as the final outcome. For example, if I am going to be creating a painting in which I'm thinking of using a lot of wet on wet, a lot of water, and I want organic watercolor effects for my background and stuff like that, I'm probably going to be reaching out for my Arches paper. Whereas if I were going to be working on more of a spot illustration with little to no background and I'm not going to be using large amounts of water, then I can get away with using student grade Strathmore paper. Every paper has its pros and its cons, and it really comes down to the specific techniques and the style and level of detail that you're after with that piece on hand. And depending on that, select the paper that you're going to be using. It's not necessary to always use one paper or the other. You also want to make sure that you've given thought to the specific paintbrushes that you're going to be using for your painting, both in terms of the type of paintbrush, whether round, flat, filbert, angled, whatever it is, and the size of the paintbrush. So if I am creating a watercolor landscape painting, which requires me covering up large areas of my paper with fast, quick washes of color and stuff like that, I'm going to be using larger paintbrushes. Whereas if I'm going to be working on a spot illustration that does not require me adding a background or adding in large washes of color, then I can get away with selecting medium to smaller sized paintbrushes. And also the level of detail. If you're thinking of making your painting super, super detailed, obviously you're gonna need very thin detailing paintbrushes. Whereas if you're looking for a more expressive, looser finish, then you can probably get away with using medium-sized paintbrushes. It can be so aggravating to try to fill in large areas of your paper with small paintbrushes. This leads to undesired textures and marks, because remember that the moment that you place your paint on paper, especially when that paper has not been pre-wetted with clean water, you're painting wet on dry, that paint starts drying immediately when you place it on paper. And this leads to edges in this large wash that you're trying to create. You're creating a texture there. So you definitely want to make sure that you're going in with a large, appropriate paintbrush that is going to help you load up a good amount of paint in your bristles and quickly lay down that wash of color, as opposed to constantly having to grab more color back into your painting and grab more color back into your painting. Also, for example, when you're painting in things like eyelashes or whiskers, you want to make sure that you're going in with a fine detailing paintbrush and that you've even practiced doing those thin tapered lines before going in, so that that line can be very, very nice and very, very thin. All of these reasons and more, it's just super, super important to give thought to the specific paintbrushes that you're going to be using. All right, so that is it in terms of the steps and the specific questions that I highly, highly recommend you go through before placing paint on paper. You're not gonna regret it. Thank you so very much for checking this one out today. I hope that it was helpful. Have a beautiful rest of the weekend and talk to you very, very soon. Bye guys.